Before we begin, don't forget that there are currently 3 applications out for the Queen's Gambit Decline, available for iPhone and for Android. Welcome back to chessopenings.com. In today's video, we'll take a look at a game which I played in Las Vegas against a player 2300, Michael Brown, played a few years ago. In an earlier video, we already took a look at the opening and middle game phase, and by doing so, we managed to penetrate a little bit deeper into the Nimzo-Indian opening, which I consider to be the strongest reply against the Queen's pawn opening. There, the game began with the moves pawn to d4, knight to f6, pawn to c4, and now pawn to e6. And with the move pawn to e6, Black prepares to develop the dark squared bishop, and he also does so in such a way that now if White plays the move knight to c3, which is exactly what White played in the game, now if White plays knight to c3, Black has access to the pin, bishop to b4, and this is an opening known as the Nimzo-Indian defense. The idea of this move, bishop to b4, is to make it very difficult for White to achieve the move pawn to e4, since now if the move pawn to e4 were played, Black could simply capture the pawn with knight takes e4, taking advantage of the pin. Instead, more commonly, White either gets on with his development with the move pawn to e3, usually followed by bishop d3, and then the knight can develop either to e2 or to f3, or another common move for White in this position is the move queen to c2, which is often called the classical variation or the Capablanca variation, and this is the move which my opponent Michael Brown chose during this contest. So White has played queen to c2, and the idea of this move is that after the natural move castles kingside, which in fact was played in the game, White can now collect the bishop pair with the move pawn to a3, attacking the bishop. Now, if Black were to retreat the bishop back to the e7 square, this would allow White to continue with the move pawn to e4 with a commanding center, and now these pawns can always advance, and White has plenty of opportunities to organize his pieces behind the pawns and to set up some kind of attack in this position. Instead, after the move pawn to a3, Black almost universally continues with the move bishop takes c3 with check. And now White continues with queen takes c3, and this was the idea of queen to c2, that White can now recapture the bishop on c3 without damaging his pawn structure with b takes c3. Black continued with pawn to b6, which is one of many moves which are available here, but this is definitely the most popular, as Black simply aims to get on with his development with bishop to b7, and at the same time, he's aiming to control this square on e4. One of the key ideas for Black in the Nimzo-Indian is that he also has restrained his pawns on d7 and c7. For now, he hasn't decided whether or not to play d5 or c5, or maybe even d6 in this position, and so Black has various options which he can choose from depending upon how White deploys his pieces. White continued with the move bishop to g5, bishop to b7 was played, and now White continued with e3, f3 also being a common idea in this position. Black continued with pawn to d6, pawn to f3 was played here, knight b to d7, bishop to d3, and again, if we're going a little bit fast here, keep in mind that we also have this information available in the previous video in which we look at the opening phase more carefully. So bishop to d3 was played, and now Black strikes in the center with the move pawn to c5. Now at the moment, White has the bishop pair, and he also has a little bit more space in the center since the pawn on d4 is more further advanced than the pawn on d6. However, a very strange feature of this position is that the pawn on c4 actually turns out to be a little bit vulnerable after the move rook to c8. Black is simply developing his pieces here. He's managed to get all of his minor pieces out, and he's castled kingside, and now he's beginning to look for an active plan of his own. And one of the downsides of White's strategy so far is that White has consumed a couple of moves with his queen, bringing it out to the c3 square, and this was a concession he made in order to gain the bishop pair. Therefore, this idea of pawn to c5 and rook to c8 has additional strength because of the presence of the queen on c3. And we're going to get a chance to see this in just a moment. So, pawn to c5 was played, and now White continued his development with knight to e2, rook to c8, castles kingside, and from here comes the move bishop to a6, beginning to apply additional pressure to the c4 pawn. At this point, Black is already pretty close to delivering a crucial threat to the c4 pawn with c takes d4 followed by pawn to d5. And at this point, I already consider Black's position to be basically equal. While White has managed to get the bishop pair and also has a little bit of extra space in the center, it's unlikely that this space advantage is going to persist for any time, because after pawn takes pawn on d4 and pawn to d5, Black will have managed to equalize the spatial situation in the center. And this means that White only has the bishop pair as an advantage in this position. But this factor will tend to be offset by the fact that Black is already generating concrete threats against the pawns here, and White needs to begin defending, as he did with the move pawn to b3. So little concessions like this are already starting to demonstrate that Black is definitely on the right track in this position. I inserted the move pawn to h6. And now White played the move bishop to h4. C takes d4 was played, E takes d4 was played, and now the move pawn to d5. And there's simply no way for White to get away from the fact that the exchange of pawns on c4 is going to leave White with weakened pawns on c4 and d4. And so we saw all of this in the previous video. White continued with pawn to a4, no doubt attempting to play pawn to a5. And also, it's important to point out here that Black is probably threatening to play b takes c4, d takes c4, b takes c4, and possibly the move pawn to b5 could have some tactical implications at some point in this position. And so the move pawn to a4 aims to get away from this kind of fact. For example, if it were Black's move here, Black could play d takes c4, b takes c4, and now bishop takes c4 would be the appropriate move order. And now after bishop takes c4, pawn to b5, Black would be ahead a pawn. This is a very concrete example of why it seems to be necessary for White to play the move pawn to a4. I now continued with the move d takes c4, b takes c4, and now knight to d5. An excellent move here, forcing the exchange of queens. Knight takes c3, and rook f takes d8. And it's around this point that we left off in the previous video, and we said that Black has a slight advantage here, as White has now lost the bishop pair, which was his only significant advantage, and he now has weaknesses on d4, c4, and on a4. And from here on, at this point, I feel that the endgame became quite instructive and also quite attractive. So it's White's move here, and there's a significant threat to capture on c4. To address these threats, White played the move knight to b5, kind of cutting the bishop out of the position for a moment. But now came the strong tactical reply, knight to e5, attacking this bishop, attacking this pawn, making use of this pin, and there's simply nothing better for White to do than to capture on e5. And now, after rook takes d3, there are a variety of small problems for white in this position. Black's rooks in this position are highly active, and it's very likely that they can be used to provoke further weaknesses in white's position. For example, if white were to try the move rook a to c1, black could now continue with rook to c5, threatening to capture on e5 and perhaps get these rooks down to the second rank. And then let's say pawn to f4, rook to b3, followed by rook to b4, attacking c4 and a4. And in all of these lines, it's possible for white to capture on a7, but he also has to worry that maybe this knight will remain out of play for some time, and the remaining pieces that black has on the board can be used to coordinate an assault, for example, by ganging up on the second rank or by capturing both the a4 and the c4 pawns. So this could be one variation. Also, if white were to try rook f to c1, again the move rook to c5 could be very powerful, and then maybe after f4, there may be pawn to g5 here, creating more weaknesses in white's position. g3, pawn takes pawn, pawn takes pawn. Now the pawn on f4 is also weak, so there may be rook to f3, for example. So there are already some critical situations coming up here for white, and white continued with the move knight takes a7, which is probably not going to be the correct option for him here, as black now continued with rook takes c4. The rooks are both now very centralized. There's a weakness on a4, a weakness on e5, and there's every possibility that this knight on a7 may remain out of the game for some time to come, and already things are getting quite dangerous. In fact, now if white tries the move knight to b5, he can simply be met with rook to c5, threatening both the pawn on e5 and threatening to capture twice on b5 up a pawn. This may be drawable, but certainly black ends up ahead a pawn very easily in this game, and only black has winning chances. Instead, my opponent played the move rook f to c1, which is probably okay here relative to the other options, as there really is no way for white to completely hold the position together without making some kind of concession. And now came a very powerful move, rook to a3. Now, certainly the move rook takes c4 is out of the question, since rook takes a1 would be check and the rook on c4 would still be hanging. And after rook takes a3, which was played, now I continued rook takes c1 check, king to f2, rook to c7, knight to b5, bishop takes b5, a takes b5, and after rook to c5, black's play has culminated in the gaining of a pawn. There's simply no way for white to avoid the capture of either the b5 pawn or the e5 pawn, and it's not going to be enough to create counter pressure against the b6 pawn, because after rook takes b5, the pawn on b6 is already defended. Now, it turns out that from here, white's chances of a draw are still fair, perhaps about a 40% chance here that white can still draw this rook ending. But in the game, he didn't manage to produce the necessary technique, and I also recall that my opponent was down on time, having not been able to cope with the complications of the earlier phase of the game without taking a substantial hit on the clock. White continued with the move rook to a8, which I think is a strong move here. But after king to h7, an important part of black's plan from here is to begin with the move pawn to g5 at a later point, because this helps to keep the pawn on e5 a little bit isolated from the support of an f-pawn. Now, after black plays the move pawn to g5, white always will have to create further weaknesses such as g3 and f4, and then takes, and the pawn on f4 will be weak. White will always have to create more weaknesses in order to defend the e5 pawn. And for this reason, because of this potential mobility of the g pawn, I feel that white could have benefited by this very tricky move, rook to a7. So let's show that again. In this position, white first plays rook to a8 check, as in the game, king to h7, and now the correct move would be to insert the move rook to a7, as a means of drawing the king out to the g6 square. Of course, if the king comes back to g8, white can give the check on a8 once again, and it would simply repeat. But after king to g6, white can now continue playing the endgame, but it's going to be a lot harder for black to include the g pawn into the position, and so after black wins the pawn on b4 or on b5, he'll only be able to play with this extra pawn. White can bring his rook to b7, and it may be very difficult for black to create any other second front on the king side because the g pawn cannot come out to g5. So to put that one more time, black's plan is not only to capture the pawn on b5, but also to play pawn to g5 and create some counterplay along the king side and against this e5 pawn in particular. White could have made this plan more difficult by inserting the move rook to a7, but in the game he overlooked this little point. Instead, white played rook to b8, rook takes b5, and now the move pawn to g4. This is a real lemon here. Pawn to g5, this has definitely been encouraged by white, and now these pawns are definitely quite split up. The pawn on e5 is unable to receive support, and at the correct moment, black can capture this pawn. So king to g3 was played, rook to b3 was played, and now, importantly, white continued rook to b7, king to g6. At this point, white can now always capture the f3 pawn in exchange for the b6 pawn because the e5 pawn will continue to hang. And so, after white played pawn to h4, I simply captured with check, king takes h4, rook takes f3, rook takes b6, rook to e3 was played, attacking the e5 pawn, rook to b5, and now the quiet move, rook to e4, which creates a powerful threat of pawn to h5 in this position. Now, if white plays the move king to g3, king to g5 will win the g-pawn immediately. So instead, white played the move king to h3, king to g5 was played, and now after the move rook to b7, instead of capturing on g4, black simply inserts the move rook to f4. Very powerful here. Now the idea is that even if white plays something quiet like rook to a7, black can simply insert the move rook to f3 check, followed by king takes g4. And if white plays rook to b8, as he did in the game, once again the move rook to f3 check, king to g2, king takes g4 check, rook to g8 check was played, king to f4, and now, of course, if white attacks the f7 pawn, black can simply continue with king to e4, which allows him to defend the f7 pawn, and rook to g4 check can be met with rook to f4. And if white plays the move rook to h8, as he did in the game, I was able to easily solve this last small problem with the move king to e4, rook takes h6, and white resigned after the move rook to f5, securing the rook, preparing to gain a second pawn, and with the king cut off, there's simply no hope for white in this endgame. The e-pawn will surely promote and cost white a rook. This game is very instructive because white only made a couple of small inaccuracies in this position. In fact, it's not exactly clear what he should have done differently in the opening. This is why, again, I repeat that the Nimzo-Indian is an exceptionally strong opening. Black was able to identify the c5 pawn break as being the best way of continuing in this position, and this is a luxury that he doesn't always have in different setups against the queen's pawn opening. Because black left his d-pawn and c-pawn back on d7 and c7 at the beginning of the game, and yet still found ways to develop all of his pieces, Black was able to create a well-timed c5, well-timed play against the center, and White suffered from the fact that his queen was on the c3 square, which allowed the c4 pawn to become a target for some time, as it's not so easily defended. Somewhere along the line, White made some kind of inaccuracy, and very quickly, White had an advantage in the endgame. From there were probably a couple of moments when White needed to improve upon his play, but having failed to do so, he went down without much fanfare in this game, and Black simply won the game. That's all for today. It's my sincere hope that you've enjoyed this video, and that it's helped you to penetrate into some of the mysteries of the Nimzo-Indian, as well as chess as a whole. That's all for today, and we'll see you again soon. Before you go, be sure to check out the 2 applications we have available for the King's Indian defense, available for iPhone and for Android.